Switching gears into something we haven't talked about completely yet, but we've kind of hinted on it across some of the lords and other talkings of the Chaos Dwarfs, is their lore, the lore of Hashut. Now, we have talked about Hashut, their demon bull god, which is basically just a greater demon of demons. And we have talked about this lore a little bit when we've talked about how their chaos, or how Chaos Dwarf Demon Smith's magic works and stuff like that. So what I want to talk about today is the lore of Hashut, all 6 of its spells and its lore attribute, and how they might possibly be put into Total War Warhammer 3. There's a lot of interesting character about the lore of Hashut. It's very reminiscent of, say, like the lore of Dark and the lore of Fire kind of smashed together almost. And we see that a lot with like the lore of Netkara. It has a lot of elements from, say, the lore of Life and other elements of other lores. And we'll see that with, when we talked about the lore of the Great Mod, has some other elements from other lores as well. So lore of Hashut does have that characteristic. It does combine a lot of lores. Typically, a lot of the like custom special lores like Hashut, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, Nurgle, all those sorts have a lot of elements of the base 8 lores, more or less. Even high magic and dark magic borrow from a lot of the attributes of the other ones. So lore of Hashut is very interesting in that, and it is again very dark and fire centric. So let's talk about the lore attribute to start off here, right? The killing, or I'm just called killing fire. The flame of Hashut kindles best in living flesh and always hungers to destroy. So the way this works in tabletop, and we're going to get pretty custom with a lot of these, the way it works in tabletop is that if you target anything with the flammable special rule, say, you know, a Tomb King, anything undead, anything that is combustible, a troll is even a good example of flammable, it basically does more damage to them. While I find that really cool and thematic, I also find it extremely limiting in the lore attribute. It kind of makes it only specific to fighting, well, things that are flammable. And you could say that some lores have that. You know, lore of light, it really only applies as much to undead than it does any other faction. So it's really only, the lore attribute itself is only advantageous towards them. So killing fire, if they put it into the game, sure, maybe it would just simply be that it does more damage to flammable things. I could be okay with that, I guess. But what I would really like to see is just, rather than it being extra damage to flammable, maybe it does persistent damage. So any of the abilities that are direct damages or hexes or winds or vortex spells, they actually kind of have persistent damage on them, like you're caught on fire, something like that. And I think that'd be kind of cool, like a smoldering effect or a burning effect. So it maybe does like just say a 50 damage, and then after a certain amount of time, like you do 30, then 20, then 10, then none, like to represent it like slowly dying out. Like a damage over time. If you're familiar with RPGs, the term dot comes to mind. So I think that'd be kind of a nifty attribute here, because I think a lot of their abilities are they're going to be pretty reminiscent to other stuff that we've heard about. And I think the killing fire with a lore attribute like this kind of makes for a really interesting flavor. And the whole lore of Hashut is about this like eternal suffering that you can inflict upon your enemy, and what's more sufferable than being just burned alive. So I think that's kind of plays heavily into it. So we'll talk then about our next spell, the Breath of Hatred. This is the signature spell. For those of you guys that know tabletop, this means that you pretty much get this right out the gate. The sorcerer's malice infects his chosen allies like an insidious malady, spurring them on to ever greater depths of cruelty and savagery. Now, this grants any unit you target in tabletop the hatred special rule, or you can do it in an area around it. Now, we won't get that, because we don't have hatred in Total War Warhammer. If we had hatred, all the Dark Elves would have it, the Dwarf Rangers would have it, Dwarf Slayers would have it. We don't see this in Total War just yet, or they've yet to add it, like I was saying. Maybe they'll do it in 3. But maybe rather than adding hatred, which basically just, you get a chance to re-roll saves. I'm sorry, not saves, but you get to re-roll attacks. So maybe rather than it being a blanket increase like that, it's maybe just a bonus to melee attack. And it talks about ever greater depths of cruelty and savagery. So maybe it's a bonus to melee attack and melee, weapon strength. So you have a higher likelihood to hit, and when you do hit, you hit even harder. Maybe that kind of plays into this. So I see Breath of Hatred just being as a very kind of mild buff spell, something that's kind of somewhat run-of-the-mill, but at the same time can be very advantageous to an army that is more stacked in the defensive end of things, because all dwarf armies are kind of like that. But I will say that when we talk a lot about the Chaos Dwarf army list, you'll see that the Chaos Dwarfs do have quite a bit of offensive potential on their side, because they have a lot of access to, well, in the 4th edition they had access to Black Orcs, but they have Hobgoblins, they have a lot of different, they have monsters, they have a lot of different means to cause a lot of damage. So I think Breath of Hatred kind of amplifies that in a lot of ways. I think that's kind of cool. But then we should talk about the first actual spell, Burning Wrath. The sorcerer calls on the fires of the deep earth and conjures forth a torrent of burning lava to immolate their enemies. So again, this kind of plays into that whole killing fire lore attribute, right? You know, immolate their enemies. You know, that basically means you're completely covering them in flames and they're smoldering out. So burning lava, and that's going to leave a lasting effect. So basically, Burning Wrath is pretty standard edition here. It is a magic missile attack. Now, this isn't something like most magic missiles that just simply do damage. This one actually has a very high damage potential. It does a d6 strength 6 hit, which is actually very, very hard hitting. So I think that this would be kind of like an Burning Wrath, kind of like, you know, I believe it's Amber Spear is also an AP magic missile, right? So Burning Wrath I would see as a high damage, or maybe even a low damage, high AP damage magic missile, something that really kind of punctures through armor. And I have another idea for AP, and I think that Curse of Hashut should have a lot of AP characteristics attached to it. So Burning Wrath, if it's got its AP damage on top of, you know, killing fire, it doing kind of a lingering, smoldering damage to things, I think would be pretty cool. Kind of, again, fits the lore of Hashut and Hashut's character itself. Now the next one's pretty interesting, Dark Subjugation. Invoking the power of Hashut, Lord of Tyranny, the sorcerer wields their master's darkly malignant force to crush the will of their foes. Basically, in the tabletop, this one's actually pretty cool and uncommon. It not only does it give you a leadership penalty, it gives you a permanent leadership reduction for the entirety of the game. Very rare. Not a lot of stuff does that. So I guess rather than it having a permanent leadership reduction, I see kind of this as just basically a Doom and Darkness copy. You know, this is something that's going to just say, boop, here you go, Dark Subjugation. Everyone gets a, or that specific unit gets a reduction to their leadership, or I can overcast it in an area and everything around gets a or a huge penalty to their leadership. Another attribute you could kind of tack onto this is maybe it lowers fire resistance to anyone that it additionally gets caught up in the cast range of it. That'd be kind of a nifty little kind of caveat or way to make this different than Doom and Darkness. And I've seen that Creative Assembly does this with other lores, right? With Nehekara, they didn't just make this, hey, this ability is just a copy of this ability with a different name. They've done that with a number of things, and I think that their own flavor that they kind of put on things is super lore friendly. So I'd love to see how they do Dark Subjugation and having it not just be a Doom and Darkness copy. I want it to have some additional stuff on it. That's what I was saying. Hey, fire resistance would be a cool thing. Now, our next spell, Curse of Hashut. Channeling the malediction that inflicts his own twisted body, the sorcerer turns the dark curse of Hashut on others, causing their bones to petrify and their flesh to grow brittle and crumble to dust. Basically what this means is the target has to pretty much, they take damage that's equivocal to their toughness, more or less. What it says here is the target suffers a number of hits equal to 2d6 minus their toughness score. So the tougher they are, they take a little bit less damage. So how could this really be computed in Total War Warhammer, right? We don't have toughness in Total War Warhammer. We do have is melee defense. We've got armor and melee defense. So melee defense is the likelihood to be hit. You could equate that in Total War or in tabletop as toughness, because when you attack someone, you use your strength against their toughness to see if you have the likelihood of even actually hitting them. If they're so tough, maybe your blow bounces off their skin, whatever it is. So maybe here, this uses your melee defense. So if you have a lower melee defense, this thing does more damage to you. Or if you have a higher melee defense, this does more damage to you. However they want to do this, I think it'd be a very interesting way to kind of take a twist on the typical direct damage spell, rather than it just being like a, hey, this is a Fate of Buna copy, which I almost said that. Looking at this, I almost said, yeah, it's kind of like a Fate of Buna. I would rather it just kind of be dependent upon the target you choose. So rather than just saying, oh, I'm going to drop this on a chaff unit and it's going to wipe that unit out, or drop this on a heavy cav unit, because it's a Fate of Buna copy, it's just going to wipe them out. I think it'd be more interesting if this had a little bit more of a variable application. You know, it depended upon what you dropped it on, decide what kind of damage it did. And we see that with a lot of spells, Fate of Buna including. Fate of Buna is not as worthwhile on a single unit as it is, a single character or small unit, model count unit, versus a large model count unit, say like, you know, a really elite heavy cav unit, or a really strong infantry unit like a Regiment of Renown. Fate of Buna does a lot more damage to those, right? So Curse of Hashut, I think I want it to be variable, and I don't, caveats or side note here, sidebar, I want Fate of Buna to be variable. So Curse of Hashut, have it do lingering fire damage with killing fire, as well as its direct damage to the unit. It can probably knock something out of the game outright, which is, you know, it is kind of a cheese thing to have a delete spell, but I think at the same time, if we increase the casting cost on this, or maybe reduce the range on it, so that the range is 18 in tabletop. That's very small for a spell in tabletop. So let's have this be computed in Total War Warhammer to actually be a very short range spell. You have to get your caster up close to get this off. And if he does get close and doesn't get wiped out for doing it, then he gets rewarded with pretty much deleting a unit. So that's how I think they should kind of balance these out, is that it's a high risk, high reward type spell. Then I guess calm down a little bit and go into Ash Storm. Ash, A-S-H, not A-S-S. It's not a storm of ass. The sorcerer calls down a hellish storm of choking hot ash, scalding and blinding anything unfortunate enough to be caught in its path. This is a pretty cool one here. Pretty simple too. The target unit suffers -1 to hit in close combat and -2 to hit with shooting attacks. So basically, and also it affects charges, it affects marching, it affects pretty much what I would consider the vigor of a unit. So the way Ash Storm I think would work either is a moving vortex like we see with Bone Storm and the such, like where it just kind of like moves around, or you just cast it or on one unit, or overcast it to a range of units. And if you do, you get a melee attack reduction, you get an accuracy penalty and a vigor penalty, and maybe even a charge bonus or a charge penalty. That's what the tabletop version of it does. And maybe having all those things is a little OP, but I think it'd be kind of nifty if it did do that kind of overarching debuff. I mean, it's a 12 plus cast in the tabletop, so it's kind of like middle of the ground between difficulty to cast and ability to get off. You'd need about 3, maybe 4 if you really wanted to get it off, die to successfully hit it. With 2 die, you have to hit 6s to get that thing off, so it's kind of a little risky. 3 die, you have a much better chance. So I think Ash Storm would be good, and I think we're going to need, I think in general, Total War needs more penalties to accuracy. There's a lot of spells in tabletop that do penalties to accuracy, because I think they realize in tabletop that, and it's a formula that I don't think Total War has really picked up just yet, how powerful ranged attack can be. And in tabletop, you have a lot of people, or a lot of units that are meant exclusively for shutting down artillery pieces or skirmishers that get in the back line and mess up 1 or 2 range units. It's hard to field as much ranged in tabletop as you can in Total War. So I think Total War's answer to that has to start becoming some spells that counter all the quote-unquote ranged meta. I mean, you can have a High Elf army that, if it's got a long enough spearman line, can pretty much just range you down. So I think that abilities like Ash Storm, especially when you're fighting against ranged armies as any type of dwarf, is going to be huge, because what's the biggest thing that dwarfs suffer from is low mobility. Yeah, dwarfs don't really suffer from that, I guess, as much, because they have bull centaurs, they have Kadai, they've got hobgoblin wolf riders and such. So take this with a grain of salt. My point here is, though, that I think having an ability that it negates a lot of the range damage, that it makes it hard for dwarfs to get to, it would be a really good idea. Man, like a second time I jumped on the pulpit to kind of like preach from on high. But let's go to our next one, Hellhammer. The sorcerer manifests the power of Hashut as a thunderous ram of roiling energy in the shape of an immense burning black hammer or a monstrous bull's head, which they can unleash across the battlefield with crushing force. Now this one's really cool, and I had a really good idea in my mind for this one. So Basically what happens here, it's a wind spell. It does amount of damage in 3d6, and they have to take an initiative test or they suffer a strength 6 hit, causing multiple wounds. So that's your tabletop synopsis of what this does. I think it'd be really nifty though if Hellhammer had an ability to do heavy AP wind damage. And I know that there's a couple wind spells out there that do heavy AP, but I think, again, these are Chaos Dwarfs. It speaks so true to like Hashut and to the army as a whole. Heavy AP damage out of a wind spell like this would be pretty cool. Now, I think it'd be pretty brutal if it was the typical wind spell length. Like, I mean, you go to attack, use any wind spell, they're all that wind splash thing, or what's it called? The little thing that pops up when you want to use a wind spell. It's the same length for every wind spell in the game. But what if Hellhammer had a very short range, so it was heavy hitting, it was AP damage, and it could do quite a bit. But what if you overcasted it, and it cost a significant amount to overcast? It's 18 up in tabletop, which is pretty significant. It would double the range just to becoming a normal wind spell's range. So if you really want to get the full use out of it, you're really going to have to use a lot of winds of magic to get there. But when you do use it, it's probably going to knock apart any heavily armored front line to at least open up a gap for you to really kind of punish the enemy with. I think Hellhammer's got to be something like that, where you can't just rip it down the whole line. If you've got two dwarf armies that are making contact, Chaos Dwarfs and normal dwarfs, I think it'd be really interesting if you could overcast it to make it a longer cast. That is the wind of magic itself, or the wind spell itself, range being increased. But we've already reached our last spell, Flames of Asgore. Fire leaps from the sorcerer's eyes and mouth as they call upon the most terrible incantations of fire and destruction, the ground cracking open and boiling magma exploding forth in a devastating eruption at their word. So this one, it's easy to say, hey, this is just a Lore Fire Flamestorm copy, but I want this to be a little bit different. The way it works in tabletop is that it does more damage the closer you are to the center of it, and I think that would be kind of cool for Total War Warhammer 3. We're supposed to get new mechanics with the third game, right? Just like we got for the second game, we got a whole slew of new mechanics. So what if they started to do vortex spells that did more damage the closer you were to the epicenter, to the eye of the storm, more or less. What I think would be really interesting is, too, if you could overcast this and increase the range. In tabletop, casting it regularly at an 18 up is a 3-inch template. You put it down, a little thing. If you overcast it, it's a 5-inch template. So imagine this ability coming onto the tabletop, or coming onto the battlefield, and it's a small ability. Or you can overcast it to get a giant, like, twister of just flame and darkness ripping through everything, and then you have, on top of it, you have Killing Fire Lore attribute going off, and the closer things are to the center. So if you cast it directly on, say, a character, if he's right in the center, it'll do a significant amount of damage to him, but this thing is going to move, and as it moves off of him, sure, it'll do less damage. But I think that's kind of a cool part of this, almost like we talked about with Killing Fire itself, how it has that kind of lingering effect that does less damage over time as things kind of smolder away. The same thing here with Flames of Asgore. You know, you're right in the center of this vortex of magic and destruction, but as you kind of move away from it, you're still getting hurt, but not as much. And I think that we're going to need to see something that breaks the mold here a little bit, breaks that template that we see across the other two games as Magic goes, as far as things are. Like, we can't just have the same stuff and go, hey, nothing new changed here. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if in Total War Warhammer 3, they did a magic overhaul of everything and just said, okay, we've now had 2 games worth of experience under our wings. We now understand what or how this magic interacts with the playfield, because they've never done magic in any Total War since now, right? This is their first real experience with it. So now that they've got time to refine it across 2 games, I'd love to see them kind of revisit some of the lores, the original lores, and have them have a little bit more flavor, or a little bit more design heavy that kind of caters to the level of battlefield you're dealing with here. This is a larger, wider, open battlefield, more so than tabletop, so you kind of have to take that into consideration rather than just saying, hey, I'm going to take this rule set, I'm going to copy it almost word for word, slap it in the game, which is a really cool fan service. But again, I think it just, once you get to the level of play that we're at now, coming into what is, I guess you could say, the height of Total War Warhammer 2, we're not tapered off to the end of it because Warhammer 3 is still a ways out. you're dealing with a lot of new mechanics and a lot of stuff that kind of makes some of the older lores feel a little bit more obsolete compared to some of the newer stuff, like especially like Lore of Plague is just beautiful. But that's my 2 cents at least. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little video here on the Chaos Dwarf Lore of Magic, the Lore of Hashut. Hopefully we'll start to hear more about Total War Warhammer 3 coming up, as the projected launch date wasn't too far from now. It's just the beginning of 2019 was when they were hoping for it, right? So hopefully we'll start to get some goodies coming out, just to at least wet the beak. And we'll start to hear more and more about our lovely Chaos Dwarfs, maybe our Chaos Demons, maybe our Ogres, maybe our Kislev. Guess we'll have to find out what the hell races we're getting first before we get excited and hyped about what the hell we're going to get. But as always, guys, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, all sorts of good action there. But have a good one, and take care.